Tonight on Bridge City News, there's been another confirmed case of the coronavirus in North America, this one in Chicago. The UCP will be reaching out to Albertans in a telephone town hall asking for input into this year's budget. And federal Conservative leader Andrew Scheer speaks with his caucus as Parliament is set to resume again on Monday.
Your nation, your province, your southern Alberta. From the heart of Lethbridge, it's Bridge City News with Hal Robbins.
Good evening. Thanks so much for joining us. A woman from Chicago has become the second U.S. patient diagnosed with the coronavirus, which broke out in China. The 60-year-old returned from China earlier this month without showing any signs of the illness, but a few days later called her doctor to report feeling sick. Earlier this week, a man in Washington state was also confirmed to have the virus. More than 800 people in Asia have been infected with pneumonia-like virus, which has now killed 26 people. China has implemented a lockdown in many centers and has limited the travel of around 35 million people. The city of Wuhan has erected a 1,000-bed hospital dedicated to the disease. Canadian Health Minister Patty Hajdu says authorities are monitoring the outbreak here very closely, and there's still no confirmed cases in Canada. The Providence Regional Medical Center north of Seattle treated the man who is believed to be the first person in North America treated for the coronavirus. Hospital staff spoke about the experience.
I would say I got the call around 9 p.m., was able to be at the hospital, I think about 9:45. Luckily, we both live close by. The page went out to the nurses that we needed to open the unit, and we were able to accept the patient around 11:30 p.m.
Then I got a call from Sarah Wilkerson, our infection control manager, telling me that we had an incoming case of coronavirus and how we should handle it.
Having the very first patient in our hospital, it is a little, scary. It's something new.
We will wear just standard rubber gloves, and we have a fluid impermeable gown that we'll put on.
In this particular patient, we weren't sure about the degree of contagiousness. We certainly did not want it to spread, so we used the highest level of protection that we have available to treat this patient.
Public health officials here in Alberta say they are prepared for any possible cases of the coronavirus. So far, there are no confirmed cases in our province. Our province's Chief Medical Officer of Health says we should, however, continue to take extra precaution.
Albertans, if they are planning on traveling, that they look at the Health Canada website that has travel advice to make sure that they know the most recent recommendations to take to protect themselves. For Albertans here at home, the important thing to know is that they're more likely to be exposed to something like influenza or another respiratory virus, and common things they can do to protect themselves against any respiratory virus would be things like washing their hands regularly, not touching hands to their eyes or their face, as that tends to be the way that we often accidentally introduce germs to ourselves. And then if people are feeling sick, it's always a good idea to avoid being around other people when you have a fever or cough.
Dr. Henshaw is urging people to seek credible information sources on the outbreak. The City of Lethbridge has approved the hiring of Crown Strategic Consulting to advocate on behalf of the city's key issues. Mayor Chris Spearman says the decision to bring in the extra help will give Lethbridge more of a voice.
What we asked is that we have an agent to help us clarify our strategic goals. Many cities already have a person on staff who is paid anywhere from $100,000 to $130,000 to provide strategic advice. What we're going to do at the City of Lethbridge is contract for that. So instead of hiring an extra employee, we would be paying $5,000 a month plus expenses for 6 months for a trial period to see how we might benefit from having more strategic advice to see if it could raise our effectiveness in raising the City of Lethbridge's profile and the needs of the City of Lethbridge with the provincial government.
For the next 6 months, the city will pay $5,000 per month plus an additional $1,000 in expenses. The total cost for the contract is $36,000. In response to Premier Jason Kenney's speculation on Tuesday that his government may consider closing or relocating our province's supervised consumption sites, Mayor Spearman said any potential closure of the SCS in Lethbridge could bring even further problems to the city.
We'll wait to see what the province does. If they move it, it certainly could create some issues for the City of Lethbridge. We would have to look at zoning. It would have to be already zoned to be a health clinic. The issue has been that the only service we've had in the City of Lethbridge is the supervised consumption site. We've been lobbying for 5 years for adequate detox, adequate intox, supported housing, and long-term treatment and care, and we need those services. So I would like to see those services provided to those in the city that need them, to make sure that people can be referred to services that will help them reach sobriety and ultimately a useful contributing life in the City of Lethbridge.
Kenny said Tuesday that he hopes the full report from the SCS review panel could be released in the next couple of weeks. Lethbridge Interim Police Chief Scott Woods tweeted earlier today that the bicycle thefts continue to be a problem in our city. Woods says with the recent warm weather we've been receiving lately, more of the bikes are disappearing from people's homes and businesses. To combat the issue, Lethbridge Police will be setting up a bike registry to help identify owners and to deter thefts. Chief Woods says the registry will be launched very soon. The family of the Lethbridge man who's been missing for 2 months is organizing a ground search of the river valley this weekend. 27-year-old Marshall Iwasa was last seen on November 17th when he was leaving for Calgary, but he never showed. Marshall's burned-out truck was later found in British Columbia, but there's been no sign of him. The family's asking for volunteers to come out and help tomorrow and Sunday in their search. You can contact the family through their Facebook page, Find Marshall Iwasa. RCMP in Rocky View County near Bicycle responded to a firearms-related injury yesterday afternoon around 3 p.m. When police arrived, they found a 30-year-old man from Saanich, BC who was shot. First aid was administered, but the man later died from his injuries. An autopsy was being performed in Calgary today, and the name of the dead man is not being released. RCMP believe this is an isolated incident, and there's no risk to the public. The province is hosting a couple of telephone town hall meetings, January 27th and 28th, to speak with Albertans about the priorities for this year's budget. During the last telephone town hall, Finance Minister Travis Taves said around 35,000 Albertans were contacted and offered their input. Those who live north of Red Deer will receive a call on Monday, and those of us who live south of Red Deer will receive a call on Tuesday of next week. The telephone town halls will be held from 6:30 till 8 p.m. The 90-minute call will be moderated along with a question and answer period. People may also dial in toll-free at 1-877-229-8493 and enter the code 115500. The UCP say participants' comments will help frame decisions for Budget 2020 and future budgets. The province also announced today that Alberta will now allow wood building construction up to 12 stories. In the past, our provincial and national building codes only allowed wood building construction up to 6 stories. Alberta will join British Columbia to allow for 12-story wood construction using tall wood and fire-resistant material in time for the upcoming construction season. Minister of Municipal Affairs, Casey Medieu, said in a release earlier today, not only will this decision support the forestry industry and land developers, it will provide affordability to home buyers, bolster employment, and give Alberta a competitive advantage. We made this change knowing that mass timber products are safe and that these buildings will meet all necessary standards. When it comes to buying a home, you need much more than just a down payment. Courtney Atkinson is a real estate broker here in Lethbridge. He says if you're thinking of purchasing, you must also put enough money aside for legal fees and potential repairs.
Yeah, when banks are qualifying people for their purchase, a lot of times they'll look for an additional 1.5% in savings, right? You got to consider that a property inspection can be expensive. When you move into a property, the thing that nobody tells you is that you've got a plan to buy that ladder, that wheelbarrow, maybe you got to buy a lawnmower, and there can be repairs that come up, to say nothing of the cost of actually closing the transaction. You've got to pay your lawyer, for example. So there's some expenses that the bank acknowledges, and they want you to have that money in the bank so that when you do close your transaction, you're prepared to move into home ownership smoothly without any hiccups.
Courtney will have more on the real estate industry, including how the market is right now in southwestern Alberta. That's coming up after business news. Ontario Premier Doug Ford says his patience is running out when it comes to teachers' unions. All 4 unions are engaged in some form of job action, including rotating strikes and work-to-rule campaigns as contract talks have broken down.
Are we treating them fairly? And the answer is yes. You know, the average wage is $98,000. That's the average, second highest in the entire country. 80% of the entire budget goes to their compensation, goes to their pensions that we're all pitching in, paying for, along with the benefits. And do you know how many teachers I've talked to that just want this to be over? They're happy. They want to get back in the classroom. I hear that over and over. There isn't a place I'm going. Even this morning, I stopped over at a gas station. People coming in, do not budge with those teachers. And I'm being frank, I'm hearing strangers everywhere, do not budge. Everyone loves our teachers. They're being treated fairly. They have to make sure they put the priority of the kids and stay in the classroom.
Federal Conservative leader Andrew Scheer addressed Tory MPs and senators today as the party plots strategy ahead of Parliament's return on Monday. Scheer once again stressed how important it is to support our country's energy sector.
And coming out of the election campaign, at the top of everyone's minds was the issue of national unity. The Trudeau Liberals were shut out of Alberta and Saskatchewan, where anxiety is running higher than perhaps we've ever seen before. In Quebec, we saw the resurgence of the separatist Bloc Québécois. Now, while Trudeau has said many of the right things over the last few weeks, we haven't seen him walk the walk. Billions of dollars in investment is still fleeing the energy sectors in Alberta and Saskatchewan, and forestry mills continue to close down in British Columbia. And we will get to the opportunity to see where Trudeau stands when it comes to the development of the Tech Frontier project in northern Alberta. Will he stand with hardworking energy workers? Will he stand with local Indigenous groups who support the project?
The Tories are also plotting their own strategies for how best to replace Andrew Scheer. The party will choose its new leader on June 27th. Some contenders have decided not to run, including former Harper Cabinet Minister Rona Ambrose and Ottawa MP Pierre Poilievre. So we're asking you on Twitter for our poll, who do you think should become the new leader of the Conservative Party of Canada? Your choices are Peter MacKay, Aaron O'Toole, Marilyn Gladu, or other. Please log on to Twitter and let us know your thoughts. We'll have the results coming up on Monday's show. The leader of the Christian Association of Nigeria was kidnapped at the beginning of January and then executed on Monday. Boko Haram has claimed responsibility. The man, Lawan Adimi, was also the pastor of the Brethren Church in the town of Mikita. Joining me now to talk about it is journalist Greg Musselman, who is with Voice of the Martyrs. Greg, was Boko Haram looking for a ransom, or is it just because Lawan Adimi was a pastor?
Yeah, it's hard to know all that, Hal, but suspicion is that he was, kidnapped, and perhaps they were looking for a ransom, which of course they're always looking for money. But I think, in the situation that, we hear about that is that it may very well have been their intent to continue to, have fear running through the Christian community. I mean, it was very public. I mean, it's one of these stories that when I heard about it, I immediately posted it on my social media, said we really need to be praying for this guy. And for those that saw the video, I mean, he was pleading for his life, but he also understood, and his quote was very powerful, God is still alive. Don't cry, don't worry. Thank God for everything. And he knew in that moment that he could be killed. And his faith, of course, was very strong, but it still sickens us when one of our brothers in Christ is killed in this way. And I mean, it just, again, you just say, how evil can these people be? But yet in the midst of all that evilness, how you see this amazing faith of this man who now, of course, leaves behind children and a widow, many friends, and he was a community leader, in his area. So it's a devastating situation, but whether Boko Haram actually were going to release him, because there was some reporting that they were looking for a third party to be able to, take this pastor, get the ransom money, and release him.
How dangerous is it for the Christian community in Nigeria right now?
It's getting worse. I've been there several times, reported from there a year ago or less than a year ago, and met widows there that have lost their husbands, children lost their dads. I mean, even this week we heard of 2 teenage Christian girls in Nigeria that were killed, murdered in another attack. And, and then we also heard not that long ago that 12 Christian men had been captured and they were killed. And it was a revenge killing for a top ISIS leader. So, I mean, the situation is getting worse, and they are sending a strong message to the Christians of Nigeria that if you don't convert, or if you, continue to do your work in the church and, try to reach people with Jesus, this is the same fate that you will have.
What can Christians do here in Canada to help those in volatile regions around the world?
Well, first and foremost, we need to pray. And, and again, it's a challenge because when we are praying, and I know that there were, I would think literally millions of people, praying for Pastor Lawan, and then to still see him be killed is devastating. But we need to continue to do that. And then as organizations like the Voice of the Martyrs, we're partnering, with Christian Solidarity Worldwide, in Nigeria, to help widows and families. So, we'll continue to do that. Organizations that work with persecuted Christians in Nigeria, to encourage them, saying we're praying for them and supporting them, and, continue to remind our government that, you know what, you need to continue to put pressure on the Nigerian government to do something about this horrible situation so that the Christians will be protected and they'll have the freedom to worship freely.
That was journalist Greg Musselman with Voice of the Martyrs. Thanks so much, Greg.
Thanks, Hal. Thanks for the concern.
There's some great family movies playing at the Mill this weekend. With more, here's the owner of the Mill, Len Binning, with another Movie Mill Minute.
A Hidden Life tells the story of an Austrian peasant who refused to fight for Nazi Germany. Putting his life at risk and facing execution, his unwavering faith and his love for his family kept his hopes alive.
I can't swear loyalty to Hitler. I can't. Do you think your defiance will change the course of things? If God gives us free will, we're responsible for what we do, what we fail to do.
Motherless Brooklyn is set in 1950s New York. It stars Edward Norton as a lonely detective with Tourette's syndrome. He's seeking to solve the murder of his best and only friend, played by Bruce Willis.
You got a head just like mine, always turning things around. Some people call it a gift, but it's a brain affliction just the same.
Do you remember what I said? She doesn't know! She doesn't know!
What don't I know?
A nice weekend is shaping up, especially if you want to hit the slopes. More sunshine and mild temperatures are on the way. A complete look at the weather picture and the BCN ski report are coming up. More sunshine and warmer temperatures are on the horizon. Jeanette Roche is here now with a look at the forecast. A beautiful weekend is shaping up, Jeanette.
Oh, what a wonderful week it has been weather-wise, and it's going to continue. Today's high actually got higher than the high. The high was 10. We actually got up to 11 degrees, a low of 2 degrees overnight, and into tomorrow, Saturday, a lovely weekend ahead of us. Tons of sunshine on Saturday with a high of 7 degrees, a low of -4 over Saturday night. It should be a little bit windy on Saturday, though. And then continuing for the rest of the weekend, also lots of sunshine and 4-degree high on Sunday. 6 degrees is expected on Monday with lots of sunshine as well. And then into the rest of the week, 9 degrees high for the Tuesday, Wednesday's high 4, and then back up into that 11-degree range for next Thursday. Should be a pretty sunny week as well with scattered clouds here and there. Average high this time of year, -2. Obviously, we are getting a lot higher than that, -14 the low. The high temperature on this day was 17 degrees. That was back in 2005. And the lowest temperature, -41. That was recorded in 1957. The sun rose this morning at 8:15 a.m. and it set at 5:12 p.m. Now, looking over to the highs for tomorrow across the nation into the west coast. Victoria and Vancouver should be seeing some showers tomorrow. High of 10 degrees in Victoria, 7 is the high expected in Vancouver. Calgary, lovely day tomorrow, 5 degrees with lots of sunshine and a high of 3 degrees up in Edmonton. Saskatoon should be experiencing some flurries, -1 is their high, and actually a chance of showers tomorrow in Regina. They had some fog earlier today, but it's going to be turning to showers. 1 degree is the high and -6 is the high over in Winnipeg tomorrow. Looking out further east, Toronto should be seeing some flurries, high of 0. 0 degrees also expected in Ottawa, but they are going to be seeing some showers. Mix of sun and cloud tomorrow expected in Montreal with a high of 3 degrees. Now over to Atlantic Canada. -2 is the high expected tomorrow in Fredericton. Halifax high is 0. -2 also up in Charlottetown with lots of sunshine. And St. John's, Newfoundland will be expecting a high of -5. Lots of sunshine though, after they continue to dig themselves out from that horrible blizzard last week. That's your forecast. Here you go, Hal. Back to you with the ski report.
No new snow on Marmot Basin, but there's still a 108 centimeter base. There's been 6 centimeters of fresh snow at Castle Mountain with a 206 centimeter base. Sunshine Village has had 1 centimeter of new snow with a 140 centimeter base. No new snow at Lake Louise, but they do have a 125 centimeter base. Mount Norquay checks in at 67 centimeters. Nakiska has had 5 centimeters of fresh powder with a 107 centimeter base. Whistler, BC has had 23 centimeters of new snow and a 239 centimeter base. Panorama just 1 centimeter fresh powder and an 84 centimeter base. And Whitefish, Montana has had 11 centimeters of fresh snow and a 280 centimeter base. And that's a look at your BCN ski report. Air Canada is apologizing to customers for a problem that caused some delays on international flights. The airline says a server issue affected its network, forced it to use alternate check-in and boarding processes last night and early this morning. It says the problem should now be fixed with operations back to normal. Air Canada also experienced problems after it launched a new booking system in early December, just ahead of the very busy holiday traveling season. Cirque du Soleil is canceling all planned performances in Guangzhou, China, to ward off the potential of spreading the coronavirus. The Montreal-based acrobatic troupe says it made the decision after Chinese officials requested the temporary closing of all indoor activities with 100 or more people to stem the outbreak. Company officials says it has a responsibility to step up and take preventative measures by making health and safety a top priority. So far, 26 people have died in China and more than 800 have been infected. There have been 2 more cases confirmed in the U.S., one in Everett, Washington, and the other in Chicago, Illinois. Canadian retail chain Sunrise Records is branching out into the United States. The company purchased For Your Entertainment, a music, film, and pop culture outlet. Sunrise President Doug Putman says the deal is valued at $10 million US and comes with more than 200 locations that he plans to continue operating under the American brand name. Sunrise Records has been expanding its entertainment business, acquiring dozens of Canadian retail leases previously owned by HMV. A market analyst is forecasting a 5 to 10% increase in oat production in Western Canada this year. That comes on the heels of a 15% increase in oat production last year. The president of Ag Commodity Research says that is too much production to keep oat prices where they are and have been over the last couple of years. Randy Stryker says prices will likely slide. He says oat sales in China have not advanced as much as expected, despite growth of up to 30% on breakfast cereals and snack bars in the Chinese market. Now, here's a look at today's markets. The TSX was down 56 points in the day to 17,565. The Dow was down 170 points to 29,989. The S&P 500 was down 30 points to 32.95, and the Nasdaq was down almost 88 points to 93.14. Oil was down $1.43 today to 54.21 per barrel. Natural gas was down 4 cents to $1.89. Gold was up $8.59 to $15.7153 an ounce, and silver was up 30 cents to $18.10 per ounce. Wheat is at $232 per metric ton, barley's at $237, canola's at $4.79, and corn is at $278 per metric ton. Live cattle were up 18 cents to $125.23. Feeder cattle were down 93 cents to $143.13. Lean hogs were down $1.28 to $68.40. And the Canadian dollar was down slightly on the day to 76.09 US. Recapping one of our top stories this hour, a woman from Chicago has become the second U.S. patient diagnosed with the coronavirus, which broke out in China. The 60-year-old returned from China earlier this month without showing any signs of the illness, but a few days later called her doctor to report feeling sick. Earlier this week, a man in Washington state was also confirmed to have the virus. More than 800 people in Asia have been infected with the pneumonia-like virus, which has now killed 26 people. So what is the average home price going for in Lethbridge? Is it currently a buyer or a seller's market here in southwestern Alberta? Real estate broker Courtney Atkinson gives us his thoughts next. But first, here's a look what's happening in and around your community.
Here's your Bridge City News community calendar. Men young and old alike are invited to come join the Lethbridge Christian Men's Choir. Practices are held every Thursday from 7:30 to 9 p.m. at Trinity Reformed Church. The choir practices are in preparation for spring concerts, as well as occasional performances at the hospital and seniors' homes. For more information, call 403-328-7985. Night to Shine is an event sponsored by the Tim Tebow Foundation and hosted by My Victory Lethbridge on Friday, February 7th. Night to Shine is an unforgettable prom night experience for people with special needs, ages 14 and older. This complimentary event begins on a red carpet with guests receiving the royal treatment, including hair and makeup stations, limousine rides, a catered dinner, and much more. For details and to register, visit myvictory.ca. And if you'd like to volunteer, email carol@myvictory.ca. Celebrate Family Day at the Galt Museum and Archives for their second annual free pancake brunch. Taking place on February 17th, beginning at 10 a.m., come and enjoy delicious pancakes, music, crafts, and games. And while you're there, check out the exhibits and complete a special treasure hunt. Admission is free. For more information, visit galtmuseum.com/events. And that's your Bridge City News community calendar.
The Alberta economy is still going through some very tough times. How has this affected the real estate market? Courtney Atkinson joins me now. He's a Lethbridge real estate broker with Atkinson Realty. Welcome back to Bridge City News.
Thanks for having me.
Okay, let's talk about the real estate market right now in southern Alberta. A lot of people are still hurting, not as much here in Lethbridge. Is it more of a soft market right now? Is it a buyer, seller's market? What are you seeing?
It's still a buyer's market technically. We've got about 7 months worth of inventory. So if there were no more sales happening, we would take about 7 months to absorb the inventory that we've got. But admittedly, if you look at the greater factors in our local economy, things are comparatively good compared to the rest of the province, I would say.
What's the average price right now for a resale home?
We're at about $285 all in for all types of properties across southern Alberta.
Okay, what about some of the more popular areas that people are looking at buying in?
Yeah.
Is it still the west side? Maybe some areas in the north, the newer areas in the north?
Yeah, we were chatting about that earlier. One of the fastest growing parts of town is the west side, right, as you pointed out. And but, I would say it really just depends on the type of consumer. I live on the south side. Some people prefer the north side. Some folks prefer the west. It really just depends on what you like. But it is the fastest growing part of town for sure.
Do you think some people prefer the south side too because you have the nice mature lots, the big trees, as opposed to the newer neighborhoods where you have just little trees?
I would say so. It has that sense of being more established. It's just a little bit more cozy, I would say. But then you get older homes, and sometimes they can come with issues, like my house has issues, for example. It's built in the 60s. So you have to trade things off. If you're looking at a new house, you get no problems and new home warranty. And in older neighborhoods, maybe you have some problems if it's an older home. But that comes with the territory, and most people are willing to accept that.
Now, I'm glad you brought up some of the older homes as well, Courtney. Would you talk about maybe aluminum wiring? The house is built in the early 70s being an issue?
Yeah, there is a little bit of that. Not a huge amount of aluminum wiring here. We do see more knob and tube from like the 20s, 30s, and 40s. But to be fair, most of that's being looked after. People have been aware of those issues for so long now that most of those homes have been upgraded to some extent. Yeah.
How about some of the lead pipe as well, like the lead making its way into your water supply?
Yeah, we
Get that
see
changed over?
more so galvanized. And again, a lot of that has been replaced over the years because what happens with galvanized is the pipes actually close in, you lose water pressure, and so people are very obligated and kind of motivated to make that change.
What do you think is really driving and affecting the market right now? Is it interest rates?
Yeah, there's a few things. We're starting to see the market turn around. We have the same amount of volume and transactions in 2019 as we saw in 2018. So that's positive. That's kind of the first time that we haven't seen any decrease in those types of numbers. I would say with agriculture and all the construction we've seen here in the past couple of years, we've got positive population growth. We've got positive GDP growth in our community compared to other parts in the province. I would say that we're looking at possibly a turn of events here if you consider all things in our economy compared to what else is going on in the province and in Canada. I'd say we're in a pretty prime spot.
And recent studies have proven as well that Lethbridge is a great place to invest, isn't it?
It is. If you look at the cost of rent versus the cost of ownership, it makes a great case for owning. House prices really aren't that high if you look at the national averages. When you look at interest rates, they're very low. And one of the things that I point out is that, we saw some changes come about from the B20, the stress test as most people know it. It didn't have a tremendous impact on the overall market, but we did see it affect some of the higher priced properties. Overall, the number of transactions has remained fairly solid. And so families are still moving. It's just which families has changed.
Do some families like to live in the more rural areas? Maybe some of the bedroom communities where they can save a few bucks, like Colehurst, Coaldale, Nobleford, for instance?
Yeah, that's a great question. And I would say that when we first started seeing mortgage regulations come into place and prices were still maybe a little bit on the high side, there was a lot of absorption in some of these bedroom communities, as you pointed out, because people were looking for more affordable places to live. They didn't mind, maybe a slightly longer commute. And if at the end of the month, maybe they're saving $400 on taxes and mortgage payments, it made a lot of sense. Now I think that our economy has stabilized. People are more back at work. Maybe they've diversified in their employment. They're feeling a little more stable, and we're seeing, I think, some of those people maybe come back to the city or maybe look more in the city than they would in the outskirts.
You know what's interesting, too? I'm glad you brought up that point. One of my coworkers was living in Nobleford, and they have, I think, 8 kids or so, but a lot of the kids' activities and their sports are here in Lethbridge.
That's right.
So they were commuting, putting on $60,000, $70,000 a year on their vehicle. So they said, you know what? That's it. We're moving to Lethbridge.
Yeah. With 8 kids, that's a lot of driving.
It is, right? At the same time, absolutely.
Yeah.
Are you noticing a decline in younger people looking for homes right now?
We thought we would, but I can't say that we are. What we're noticing is that the younger people that we're working with are coming to us prepared to engage somebody in their family or somebody else to work with them on their mortgage, maybe as a co-signer or a co-owner of the property to help them get in because of some of these mortgage changes. But it hasn't dropped off. We're still seeing strength in the absorption of those properties in the, say, the 225 to 275 range in many cases by those young families.
And is it still 5% down for first-time homebuyers?
It is. That's the general standard in Canada. The role that the B20 has played, or the stress test, as we've said, has required now people to have an additional, or to qualify on an additional 2% above the basic interest rate. So that's meant that it's, you're going to be able to afford a little bit less house, and you may require a slightly more down payment to overcome some of that. So it's played a role, and I think that people have mitigated that by either borrowing money or engaging other people in the purchase of their home.
Let's talk percentage when it comes to your debt ratio.
Yeah.
How much mortgage can I actually afford compared to my salary?
Right. Trick question. I believe that the number is under 40, like it's a 39 or 35 or something like that.
That's PIT, principal, interest, and tax?
From my perspective, it's fairly high. Like when you look at what's left over for, going to the movies, putting gas in your car, and those other things,
grocery bill,
that's a big commitment to a mortgage payment, right? And all the other debts that a person might be carrying. So, but I think it's still conservative. And I have to say this: when I look at what the government has done for Canadians, in some ways I'm supportive of it. As an industry member, I want to sell all the houses. Let's make no mistake. But at the end of the day, we also want people in our community and in our country to be stable, to have homes, and to be able to know that should things change with mortgages or the economy, that they'll still have that affordability and still be able to stay in their homes. So I respect some of the changes, but we would like to see some systematic acknowledgements of communities like ours where the risk isn't so high like we see in Toronto or Vancouver.
And let's talk about people buying a house for the first time as well, Courtney. There are other expenses outside of the down payment, right?
That's right. Yeah, when banks are qualifying people for their purchase, a lot of times they'll look for an additional 1.5% in savings, right? You got to consider that a property inspection can be expensive. When you move into a property, the thing that nobody tells you is that you've got to plan to buy that ladder, that wheelbarrow, maybe you got to buy a lawnmower, and there can be repairs that come up, to say nothing of the cost of actually closing the transaction. You've got to pay your lawyer, for example. So there's some expenses that the bank acknowledges, and they want you to have that money in the bank so that when you do close your transaction, you're prepared to move into home ownership smoothly without any hiccups.
And one thing I noticed as well when I bought my house last summer is that actually buying the house, you have to pay your real estate lawyer a little bit more than actually selling the house.
Yeah,
it's a little more paperwork, a little more involved. It's
There-
almost twice the price too. It's like
It is.
$1,100
Just,
versus
it's right.
$500, right?
It's a little bit more. You're right,
Yeah.
because they've got to assign the mortgage. They've got to take mortgage instructions. So there's more work on their part. It can be fairly complex if you're to see the back end of all those mechanisms and how it works. So it's justified, but I understand that it is a surprise for a lot of people.
A big part of your business, obviously, is resale housing. But how about people that say to you, you know what, Courtney, I actually want to build a house. What are the advantages and disadvantages of each?
Well, the clearest advantage is that you get exactly what you want, right?
And the new home warranty.
That's right. And new home warranty, which
7
is,
years?
It's now 10, right?
Oh, it's 10 years.
Yeah,
There you
it
go.
is. And so one of the greatest things is you get what you want, you've got that home warranty, and you don't really have a lot of the risk that you might have in, say, a 20-year-old property or in a house like mine built in the 60s, right? However, the disadvantages are that, maybe you don't like living in a brand new neighborhood, maybe you're looking for more mature trees, maybe you're not keen on having construction anywhere near you. So there can be some drawbacks. It really just a matter
Or
of
who's going to
preference.
build beside you as well, right?
Well, that's right.
I remember a house I built in Red Deer many years ago, and I saw this young man and his father building beside us. I'm like, oh, that's wonderful, right?
Right.
It turned out it was a party house for his 19-year-old son and all of his buddies.
Yeah, these things do
So
happen.
the police were called a few times, let's just say, right? Because you really don't know.
I have to tell you, I think it was last year, maybe a year before, I had a client that we sold a house for. It was about 1 year later. They called me and said, hey, Courtney, I think we'd like to sell the property. And it was because of a neighbor that had moved in since. They built a house. This couple was loud. They were argumentative. They had barking dogs. And it really just diminished their quality of life. And of course, when they moved in, there was nobody there, right? So these things do happen.
So what would you recommend to somebody who's considering buying in a certain neighborhood? Would you say go to that neighborhood maybe on a Friday night or a Saturday night?
Yeah.
See what it's like? Maybe check out the Tim Hortons. You kind of get a lay of the land of who's living in the neighborhood, perhaps?
I feel like you're stealing all my real estate tips. If you're ever looking for work, let me know.
Right, I'll give you a call.
But no, that is indeed one of the best things that we can say. If you're not quite sure the types of neighborhoods that you want, we like to say, go take a Saturday walk. Go take a Friday night walk, right? That's a really good indicator, or a Saturday night walk, just to see what's happening in the neighborhood, who the characters are. Do you see children, or do you see multiple cars coming every 20 minutes, right?
There might be a drug house.
For all the wrong reasons.
Okay, yeah.
So these are the types of things that we say to people, hey, listen, especially when you're narrowing in, at the beginning, maybe we're looking at 2 or 3 neighborhoods, maybe 10 or 15 houses. But once you're narrowing it down, maybe if there's a couple different neighborhoods, spend a little bit of time. I mean, that half hour or 2 hours spent kind of snooping around the neighborhood periodically can really pay dividends in the long run.
Let me ask you something. Would you take on a listing that's a former grow-op?
Oh yeah, in fact I have. I know
But
a
you
lot.
have to divulge that information,
Oh,
correct?
absolutely.
It's the law.
It is indeed the law. In fact, I think we've sold 2 or 3 that I can think of just off the top of my head. There's a lot of due diligence required to bring those properties back from the brink first and foremost. And you're absolutely right. It must be disclosed that that was formerly a grow-up. But I must say that, you know, Alberta Health Services and all of the kind of mechanisms tied to bringing these properties back to being healthy again, they've really done their due diligence. And I feel comfortable as an agent representing those properties. But you want to make sure that the consumer, the buyer, is aware of that. And they often want to know about what effort has been made to make sure that these properties are safe, right?
Do you have to remediate to the point where you have to strip down the walls and maybe the studs as well because the mold gets into the wood?
Yeah, one of the things that's most common is that you'll tear all the drywall off, anything organic, like insulation, although it's not organic.
Very porous, right?
That's right, it's porous. And then they'll spray the studs with a special material. Same with the sheeting, same with the attic. You know, really right down to the very basic home and then kind of start over again. But the wiring and the plumbing and those types of things is often just fine.
How about UFI?
UFI?
Yeah, urea formaldehyde foam insulation.
Yeah.
You know, that's an issue with some of the older homes. And asbestos too.
Yeah,
Do you still come across those problems?
We do, absolutely. So, you know, we know the age of properties to be looking for these types of problems. Most property inspectors are well aware. Most realtors, frankly, are well aware of the age of house where this can be a problem. And usually with a simple visual inspection, we can identify whether or not that's a potential issue. The great thing about it is that it's really not going to be a problem unless you're disturbing it. So, for example, you know, if there's some asbestos in a property, it's actually not going to hurt anybody being there. But if you happen to be doing construction or you're disturbing
Don't disturb it, yeah.
That's right. It's the dust that can cause the problem. So, you know, it's the awareness of whether or not it's an issue sitting where it is. And if you intend to do renovations, then it can be very costly to remediate.
How about interest rates? How are they looking right now? And where do you see them going in the next maybe year or two?
Yeah, I mean, that's anybody's guess, but I'll weigh in on that. I had a colleague reach out to me, it was a friend, a guy that I went to school with a couple years ago, say, hey, Court, you know, I've got a renewal on my property at 2.5%. Do you think I should take it? And I thought, yeah,
that's great.
You should definitely sign this paperwork.
Is that for a 5-year close?
Yeah, this was a 5-year close.
Wow.
Yeah, and so we're seeing rates like that, you know, anywhere from like 2.5% to 3% fairly consistently on fixed closed mortgages. And so, you know, those are tremendous rates. Like when I bought my first house, it was probably 6%, and I've heard stories of people paying upwards of 30%. So, I mean, really, these are record low rates. Because
and a lot more money goes towards the principal, right? Instead of the interest.
It does, that's right. And you know, there's no reason based on the economics that we're seeing in Canada right now that that's likely going to change dramatically. So, you know, some people say, well, should I take a variable rate mortgage or lock mine in? Historically, people with variable rate mortgages will do better, but the rates are so low, there's really no harm in locking it in. So it's really just a matter of risk assessment, what you're most comfortable with.
Do you think it's really helpful for people to cash in their RSPs towards their down payment?
I think it's possible or logical, I should say, if you've got access to RRSPs and you're interested in getting away from some of the CMHC fees. You know, maybe that allows you to put 20% down on your property, that lowers your overall payment, and then you can pay your RSP back and build that up over time. So I'm an advocate for that if those funds are available, but I'm also an advocate for buying real estate in general. So if you have to borrow the money from a family member, I still think that that's a fine idea.
It's always good to build equity when it comes to a house. But let me ask you something. What about percentage of an increase have we seen over the last couple of years here in Lethbridge? Is it maybe 2.5%?
Yeah, good
as opposed to the big cities, right, like Vancouver and Toronto?
Good question. We really haven't seen a typical appreciation on a property in several years. If we look at the average house price in Lethbridge, we've been fairly stable at about $275,000 to $285,000. But where you really see that difference, what we're talking about here, are in the more expensive properties, say in the $400,000 to $800,000 range. You know, if a person bought one of these properties, say 5 years ago, it's very unlikely that the value is going to be more than what it was then. There are still cases of that. I don't want to say that it's entirely uniform, but for the most part, we are seeing depreciation in that time frame. Once you get under $300,000, the prices have been fairly stable. But we're not seeing appreciation yet, and that goes back to that point that I was making earlier. I think that that's coming in the next 3 to 5 years. We're starting to see more stability, a little bit more robust, some good news coming out of our local economy, our regional economy. So we think that that will lead to some prices increasing in the near term.
When you get these assessments from the city, notice of assessment, what your property's worth, right? That's not what your actual property's worth. You can sell it for a lot more than what the city's assessing it at, right?
Yeah, I feel like you're reading my mind. Thanks for asking me that question.
How much more? Like what percentage? Let's say a house, they assess it at 300.
Yeah,
right? The city.
And this isn't meant to be disparaging against our city, but my question to you would be, is the city in the business of generating revenue from taxes, or are they in the business of knowing exactly what your house is worth? I mean, obviously it's the former. And so they don't have a team of appraisers and realtors over there assessing each and every property. They make adjustments based on neighborhood averages at best. And so they don't get inside these properties, and they don't have the same sense that a person like you who's just bought a property might have about a neighborhood, or somebody like me who sells a lot of properties in the run of a year. So really we look at those just as a measure of how it relates to your taxes, and that's it. We don't consider that actually when it comes time to evaluation.
Although it's maybe a blessing having it come in a little bit lower, then your taxes will be lower, right?
Oh, absolutely. We love a low tax assessment.
What's the mill rate right now?
Oh, that's a trick question too. I don't know. We say roughly about 1%.
1%,
It's
yeah.
about 1% of the
1%?
property's value, more or less.
That's right, yeah, okay. How about co-purchasing a home with your parents, maybe with some friends? Do you see any of that?
We see lots of that. And I would say we've seen a distinct increase in that over the last year. Maybe that's precipitated by the B20 and some of the rules coming out of the OSFI. But it seems that people are managing that, and it seems like there's enough wealth in our community to be able to support young people that are trying to get into real estate. And so we're encouraged by that. My only consideration is that I think that that's an unintended consequence of this B20 change, and we really don't know how that's going to manifest. You know, you got somebody entering their retirement years, and now they're tied up into 2 mortgages. How will that play out? It's anybody's guess.
Courtney Atkinson, broker with Atkinson Realty. Thanks a lot for joining me today in studio.
Great to chat.
Canada has been under pressure from the United States to contribute our fair share to NATO. Should we be upping our game a little bit? Do we rely a little too heavily on the United States to defend us? Joining me now to talk about this is Christian Leupprecht. He's a security expert and a professor at the Royal Military College of Canada and at Queen's University in Kingston, Ontario. Joining me from Kingston. Christian, welcome back to BCN.
Thank you.
Now, before we get into what Canada's contributions to NATO should be, can you explain to our viewers exactly what the role of NATO really is?
So inherently, NATO is primarily seen by people as a military alliance. And so as an effort to get countries together and to pool resources, think about the economies of alliances where as overcoming collective action problems, you put everybody's resources together, and presumably you have more than if you just added them all up individually. But there's a lot more to NATO than that, because it's also meant as the famous first Secretary General of NATO, Lord Ismay, said, what's the role of NATO is to keep the Russians out, the Americans in, and the Germans down. And thus keeping the Americans in is critical because it signaled from the beginning that one of the challenges was always going to be to make sure the Americans stayed on board, and that the Americans were always going to be an ambiguous partner in this undertaking at best, and that all the other members would have to work hard to make sure the Americans would remain part of the alliance. And of course, the first crisis we have about what's known as burden sharing, so what everybody's contributing, dates back to John Foster Dulles, 1953 in December. So we've been at these conversations about NATO, what everybody should contribute, and how best to posture the organization for a very long time. But of course, it is the 70th anniversary of NATO this year, and it shows that the organization, despite many changes in the world, has proven itself very resilient, and I think it has done so precisely because it is useful and has proven useful in asserting and defending our interests, our values, our prosperity, and our democratic way of life.
Yeah, at the recent NATO meetings, Canada got some pressure from U.S. President Donald Trump to step up to the plate and contribute much more to NATO. I think he said something around 2% of our GDP. How much are we actually putting in now, and should we actually maybe be putting a little bit more in?
So since 2014, the NATO Wales Summit, there's been an overall increase in NATO defense spending among collectively and among most of the allies. And this was sort of a recognition that the international security environment has changed, and so that everybody needs to be spending a little bit more. Now, how much more, of course, is difficult to say, because if we think about defense spending, I think of it as a sort of insurance policy. It's a premium that you pay because in case the house burns down, you want to make sure that you're covered. And that depends on how you perceive the international security environment. And so if you're a country such as Canada, then the risks are perhaps perceived, at least, as being a little bit lower than if you're a country such as the United States. And so that's also partially where these debates stem from. But this idea of 2% was always an aspirational goal. We currently spend 1.3% roughly. We intend to ramp that up to 1.4% perhaps by 2023-24. But ultimately, this is, if you think about this differently, it's 25 billion Canadian dollars. And it's a little bit over a quarter of direct federal government program spending. And of course, every dollar that we spend on defense is a dollar that we don't have to spend on other federal government priorities, whether that's healthcare, education, infrastructure, transfers to the provinces, you name it. And so Canadian politicians have always been very savvy at trying to balance what's sort of the minimum that you have to spend for the maximum effect that you want to get. A colleague of mine called this the Walmart approach to Canadian defense policy. You know, you don't want to go too low, but you also don't need to get the Cadillac version and sort of just kind of what's just right. The question is, of course, given the continued pressure on the changing security environment, and I think what awaits us over the next 25 years will probably be even more challenging than what we had over the last 25 years, and the what's sometimes called the rusting out of Canadian equipment, so many challenges in terms of renewal for the Canadian Armed Forces. It probably suggests that if we want to continue to be a value player, we will likely have to make a more considerable investment in national defense, or our capabilities are going to decline fairly precipitously in the coming years.
So, Christian, where does Canada rank within NATO countries when it comes to contribution levels? Are we in the middle, maybe near the bottom?
So that depends entirely on how you measure. So in terms of authorized troop strength, we're the 8th largest military within NATO. We're in the top 20 militaries in the world. In terms of GDP spending, we're in the bottom third of NATO countries. But there's really only, in terms of absolute numbers, a handful of countries that spend more. The United States, the United Kingdom, France, Germany, Italy, all of which are much larger countries by population and also significantly larger economies. And on a per capita basis, it's the United States, Norway, the United Kingdom, Denmark, the Netherlands, France, Germany, and Greece. So about half the NATO member countries, not quite, that spend more. So it's entirely depends on how you measure. But on many of these measures, Canada doesn't actually look as impoverished in its defense spending as some of the critics in the United States would make it out to be. Keep also in mind, of course, that we can have conversations about where Canada ranks, but we can also have conversations about how much the United States is spending. It is often said that in the United States, defense spending is essentially equalization. All other federations have equalization programs. The United States is the only federation, advanced industrialized democratic federation, that does not. And so the significant defense spending means that every state in the United States gets a significant base and gets a significant part of the of military industrial R&D or manufacturing capacity. Think also of the immense healthcare costs in the United States that we've distributed differently in Canada. And so there are also explanations why, compared to the Americans, we look significantly lower, that are not necessarily attributable solely to what is actually being spent on defense.
So obviously Canada is not going to be a heavyweight in NATO like the United States, but really what should we be striving towards? Should we be maybe spending more on fighter jets, drones, ships, or even tanks?
So I think this is a very apt conversation, because over the last 15 years, the Canadian Armed Forces have done a lot of counterterrorism missions in various capacities, whether that's as advise and assist missions in northern Iraq or in Afghanistan, whether that's the early combat missions in Afghanistan, or whether it's the special forces missions in Northwest Africa. And it turns out that we've kind of forgotten to do a whole lot of other things. And so I think the challenge going forward for the Canadian Armed Forces is going to be to make sure that it can remain a comprehensive, full-spectrum military that can deliver on whatever mandates and requests it gets from the Prime Minister, And so that means, I think, thinking not so much just in terms of things that fly, things that float, or things that drive, but it means thinking about what are the challenges that we're likely to see in the 21st century that are rather unconventional challenges. Consider the cyber attacks and cyber environment to which we're exposed to on a daily basis. Consider that if you buy a fighter jet, but that fighter jet doesn't have a capacity for compressed data download, it is largely useless in a 21st century fighting environment. And so it means that we need to also rethink about how it is that the Canadian Armed Forces need to fight in the 21st century, what challenges they're likely to face, and how they can best confront those challenges. And that means, I think, thinking less just in terms of kit and also in terms of what effects we will need to achieve with that kit and with the people behind the kit, because of course it means in a highly technological environment, those highly qualified personnel are also in high demand by the private sector. And so being able to recruit, maintain, generate, and employ that highly qualified force is an increasing challenge for the Canadian Armed Forces to remain competitive.
What about the Arctic? I mean, Russia certainly has interest in increasing its authority and presence there. How well is Canada positioned to really assert our authority there?
Yeah, the Arctic is a significant challenge. It depends on how you see the Arctic, whether you see it as a cooperative environment in terms of search and rescue and the environment where we have very, shall we say, cordial relations with Russia, and we have joint agreements with Russia through the Arctic Council, whether you see it as a competitive environment, for instance, for resources, whether that's with Russia, the United States, or even China that is now showing up in the Arctic, or whether you see it as an adversarial environment where you see Russia as a possible contender and adversary. And so how you answer that question very much depends what resources you invest in. If you look at the mandate letter for the Minister of National Defense, clearly the Arctic plays an important role, and the ability on the one hand to have intelligence, surveillance, and reconnaissance assets and the ability to respond, as well as the NORAD renewal, much of which is going to necessarily happen in the Arctic, is important and significant. But I think in the age of great power competition, the Arctic is simply a secondary theater to the broader competition. And in great power competition terms, that always means nuclear competition, nuclear weapons, and nuclear power. And so it means the capability in the Arctic to be able to intercept a brand new generation of nuclear weapons, sometimes known as the third nuclear age, of hypersonic intercontinental ballistic missiles and hypersonic cruise missiles. That's ultimately the next challenge. And so if there is a conflict in the Arctic, it would likely be a secondary and spillover effect from perhaps a conflict due to great power competition elsewhere in the world. And so that's ultimately what the Canadian Armed Forces need to be prepared for. But it's not really an environment, I think, where anybody really wants to fight a war or contend a conflict, but we need to be prepared for the possibility that that spillover effect may become a reality and be prepared for that.
How much of a difference does NATO really make? If there was actually an attack on a NATO country, would this coalition of countries actually join forces, spend huge bucks, and maybe risk lives?
Well, this is what Article 5 is ultimately about, and this is what Emmanuel Macron alluded to with his comments about NATO being brain dead. Notice that he didn't say dead, he said brain dead, and this was in reference to some of the U.S. actions in Syria and withdrawal there that was perceived as perhaps not the United States not necessarily making good on their Article 5 commitments. Now, of course, I'm not so convinced about that, because the only country that has ever benefited really from the Article 5 is, of course, after 9/11, when Article 5 was called in. It was called in by no other country than Canada. And so the United States understand that they, just like with burden sharing, may eventually be the greatest beneficiary from Article 5. And so I think the United States will continue to have an interest in providing that deterrent effect and reassuring the member states that when push comes to shove, they're actually going to be there for them. Remember that as much as Washington likes to think that the world is all about the United States, it is really still all about Europe. And until the Second World War, the United States was a regional power, and it's only since the United States has been able to control Europe that the United States has become a superpower. The contest is really still in the world very much about who controls Europe, and so the United States have a key interest in the unity, harmony, and the territorial integrity of European NATO member allies. Various remarks, I think, by the current U.S. administration notwithstanding.
Now, when you take a look at some of the more aggressive countries around the world, which do you see as the most likely to even start a war? Maybe North Korea, Russia, Iran? What are your thoughts? China?
The challenge in this environment is that how you understand a war, that in a kinetic environment, if we think about that great power conflict is really still a nuclear conflict, the ultimate deterrent remains mutual assured destruction. And that's what ultimately will prevent a country such as North Korea from getting the wrong idea, because they know they will be wiped off the face of the earth if they try to send one of those missiles in the direction of North America. On the other hand, you can argue that we are already in a very significant war on a daily basis, which is in cyberspace and the electronic warfare space, where we on a daily basis are exposed to various attacks by adversaries that intentionally keep those attacks below the threshold of the implication of international law, below the threshold of NATO Article 5 collective defense, and therefore also below the threshold of the application of the UN Declaration of Human Rights, for instance. And so that's what makes this conflict in cyberspace so dangerous, because it means it's very much an anarchic environment where each and every day adversaries attack us, try to attack our critical infrastructure. We see some of this bubbling up to the surface when it comes, for instance, to conversations about our democratic institutions and our democratic processes. And there's a real risk of the attempts by our adversaries to go after our critical infrastructure systems in one way or another to spill over into a kinetic conflict. And so it's this uncontrolled cyber environment that we already live a hot conflict on a daily basis that probably poses the greatest risk of then subsequently spilling over into a kinetic conflict that no one may ultimately be able to control because of the broader unintended consequences of how irresponsibly some of our adversaries are behaving in the information environment.
Christian Leuprecht is a security expert and a professor at the Royal Military College of Canada and at Queen's University in Kingston, Ontario. Thanks for your time today.
Thank you. It's been my pleasure.
On behalf of all of us here at BCN, I'm Hal Roberts. God bless, and thanks so much for watching.